Hello, welcome back. I am going to do a brief series on literary criticism. This is based off of a lesson I gave while doing long-term sub work at a school that I used to teach at. Um, and I coordinated with the teacher there, and I said, "Hey, we've never really taught students literary criticism, and I think it's really valuable." So with that in mind, although this is aimed at sort of like a late high school, early college, entering college audience, and not certainly at children, I put memes in here left and right, and I apologize. They were stale when I put them in here almost a year ago, and they probably have not held up all too well. But without further ado, let us begin. Stale memes. Okay, so objectives here. And I've written it like a teacher would write it up on the slides, but um, what my real goal is to talk about sort of the history of literary criticism, give the tools needed to talk about what goes into each of these different approaches, and give students a chance to really look at that. So if you're a writer or a reader, this is helpful to you either way. So it lets you think about how people are writing. So literary criticism is the way we talk about literature. It's not just being negative. A lot of critics, when we think of critics, we think like film critics, movie critics, book critics. And oftentimes they take sort of a negative approach because we're used to thinking of them as more of reviewers than critics. But critics think about how literature was made. And of course, sometimes there is criticism in the sense of we don't like this, we do like this, but it's often more sort of what did they do here, how did they do it. Um, so there are a bunch of different schools of thought that go into literary criticism. They're not mutually exclusive. You will see people use more than one. Um, and why do we have literary criticism? Um, it covers what we would call the upper end of Bloom's taxonomy in the field of literature. So Bloom's taxonomy sort of classifies cognitive tasks based on how difficult they are, not necessarily in raw difficulty, but in terms of how much you would expect someone to know before they're able to do it. So literary criticism is useful for writers and artists and even readers who want to get the most from a text. Um, it's not about knowledge, comprehension, or application. Those are lower level Bloom's taxonomy things. Literary criticism isn't necessarily about figuring out what was said, um, though it can often focus on that in some of the structural forms. Um, that's not the end goal. That's maybe a process within the criticism method. Um, it'll so literary criticism primarily focuses on what I call the three patrician skills, and they're the upper three of the six-part Bloom's taxonomy. Analysis, which is your ability to sort of talk about it in depth and explain what's going on and why. Synthesis, which is the ability to create. Um, People will have different definitions of what that means as synthesis. Do you have to write literature, or can you write about literature? So not every critic is going to write literature of their own, just depending on the philosophy that goes into that school. Um, and I'll actually talk about some places in some of the later specific schools of criticism where I find synthesis by these authors to be very good, and where they're specifically writing fiction or literature that ties into their method of analysis. And then last but definitely not least, you have evaluation, which is the ability to make judgment calls about whether a decision was effective or not, and sort of evaluate both the purpose and the effectiveness at that purpose, and sort of the effectiveness overall beyond just that one single context. So that evaluation is either the highest or second highest. Some people flip synthesis and evaluation when they record Bloom's taxonomy. Let's talk about the history of literary criticism. It goes back about 2,600 years, basically as long as we've had writing. I'll talk about Aristotle's Poetics and the Natya Shastra in a moment because they're pretty important. The Natya Shastra isn't used a whole lot, but it's interesting to see that basically the moment societies start to become literate, they start developing literary criticism. Um, Classical and medieval criticism, I'm also going to gloss over. We're not going to have any long discussion of it. Basically, classical would be Aristotle's Poetics. Natya Shastra is very similar, even though it would not be considered classical by everyone because it's taking place in Asia instead of in Europe. Um, Medieval criticism is more focused on religious elements in text. The medievalists or the medievals don't really do a lot of experimentation so much as refinement of theories. Um, and that sort of changed when you get into the Enlightenment, where people start thinking of reason and individuals more, and Romanticism, which is sort of a reaction to the Enlightenment, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then there's a break between sort of these historical forms of criticism and modern criticism. Uh, my personal theory is that you have a lot more literate people going out and making up their own minds about things. And so there's a lot of stuff that goes into just the sheer number of people doing criticism leading to more divergence. But there are other reasons that I'll discuss when we get to sort of modernity. Um, but let's talk about classical literary criticism. So classical literary criticism is heavily shaped by what we would call probably proto-literate society. So these are places where people can read. Reading is a thing, both for trade, religious purposes, stuff like that. Stuff's being written down, but it's not something where you would expect the average person on the street to be reading. The literacy rate is not necessarily single digit, but it's low double digit if it's that high. Um, and the two sort of great early works are Aristotle's Poetics, which we can date back to 335 BC. It's a very philosophical text. It asks a lot about like why do we write, but it also has other elements. Aristotle sets out what we would consider to be modern terms in terms of drama, tragedy, and comedy, lyric poetry. He discusses the epic as a structure. One of Aristotle's theories is that literature serves as a form of mimesis, which is an imitation of life, um, and that tragedy is designed to give us the feeling of catharsis, which is this emotional experience. It's sort of a mixture of fear and pity, but it's almost like you learn a lesson vicariously through someone else's like personal struggle. Um, Aristotle's Poetics is largely structural in terms of how it looks at texts. Not exclusively, but when you see later structural critics, they will sound, at least on the surface, very similar to Aristotle. They lose some of the philosophical elements. Then we have the Natya Shastra, which was probably written somewhere from 200 BC to 200 AD. It might predate the Poetics, but that seems unlikely. There's like a 300-year window on either side of that. 200 BC to 200 AD is when we have a complete copy of it from, uh, but we don't know if there's other outside going uh, other directions uh, for the actual origin. But one of its theories is this theory of rasa, which is this idea that art entertains, but it also transcends with spiritual and moral elements, which is actually similar to a lot of what Aristotle says in the Poetics. Um, the Natya Shastra also has this structural approach to poetry, song, and dance, and it places a heavy emphasis on actors as sort of the conveyors of this sort of mystical experience in literature where the audience isn't just experiencing it for entertainment, but they're thinking about like philosophical, sort of transcendental questions of like, how should we live if we were in these situations? And then we get to the Enlightenment and Romantic criticism. Basically, the criticism in the Enlightenment and Romanticism is often very immature by our modern standards in the sense that it's not really built around some of these ideas of sort of scholarship. It's often very personal. You might think someone's a bad writer and you're attacking them at the same time you're attacking their work. But one of the reasons why it burgeoned and was really so different from the criticism that came before it, both in the classical and the medieval sense, which we sort of skipped over, um, is that the Enlightenment is when literacy rates go very high. So more people read, literature is becoming more prevalent as a prominent art form. Whereas in medieval life, you probably have a lot of images and iconography that are worth looking at. Like the first novel is Don Quixote by a lot of standards, and that's not until a pretty far chunk into the late medieval era, early Renaissance. Um, which isn't to say that there weren't other written works, but they were more within those classical forms, and so they didn't get quite as much attention from critics. There wasn't experimentation in the same way, even though obviously there was a lot of change because these writings were being made hundreds of years apart by people speaking often different languages. Latin was common, but a lot of medieval literature was written in the vernacular. There just weren't the communities to really develop unique styles and unique criticism forms. Um, so Enlightenment criticism is more of a general commentary on why something and its author was awesome or sucked. Um, there's a focus on style, personal lives, political beliefs, religion. We'll talk about biographical criticism. That's one of the things that comes along in the Enlightenment, even though it's still a fairly influential modern form. Uh, Enlightenment criticism often looks at authors more personally. Again, part of the focus of individuals and reason. Um, Now, the difference between the Enlightenments and the Romantics could be said in part to be the difference between individuals and reason and individuals and emotion. Romanticism loves aesthetics. The guy on the side of the screen here is Goethe, and Goethe is both an Enlightenment and a Romantic figure. He's sort of late Enlightenment. He sort of starts the Romantics off. He doesn't like the Romantics very much. He writes a book called The Sorrows of Young Werther, which kicks off, in many ways, the Romantic movement, but it's sort of his own self criticism of when I was a stupid kid, this is what I did. And so it's semi autobiographical. And Romanticism focuses a lot on sort of humble subjects in these extraordinary situations, or very sort of experimental high art where you've got like Goethe's Faust is considered to be in romantic work, and it follows this like magician who figures out how to rule the world, but then in the end he sort of sacrifices his soul to do that. And so the Romantics are very much more on emotion and aesthetics. They have this theory of what's called the sublime, which is like beauty, but for other forms of emotion, sort of like how catharsis isn't necessarily just being entertained. The sublime is not just enjoying what you see, it's sort of a deeper, more almost often terrifying experience. And the Romantics influence a lot of later writers. Edgar Allan Poe is late Romantic. We would probably call him a Gothic writer. The Gothic movement spun off of Romanticism. But if you can think of Edgar Allan Poe's sort of focus on the macabre and sort of gory horror um, stuff, that's one of the things that goes into Romanticism. And Romanticism also opens up a lot of experimentation with style. Um, if we look at Edgar Allan Poe as an example, again, even though he's very late, Edgar Allan Poe lays out the short story format. Like before Edgar Allan Poe, that's not to say there were no short stories, but it wasn't considered a separate form. And so Romanticism's focus on the individual as emotion takes us away from sort of the biographical criticism of the Enlightenment and towards something new that we're going to see played out in other ways in modern criticism. All right, that's where we're going to wrap it up here. I should have another video up tomorrow that will cover a few other schools of criticism. I think we'll talk about the very early pre-moderns, or not pre-moderns, but moderns, and then maybe a couple other schools within that. All right, have a good one. I'll catch you all tomorrow.